Hello, everybody. Welcome to Reddit Roast number 23. I think we're at, Mel.
Yes,
Great to
welcome
see,
to Box 23.
great to see you again. We've got quite an interesting set of profiles today. We have a military applicant who's hoping to transition to investment banking. That's always an interesting conversation. We have somebody with a very, very low GPA who's wondering whether an MBA is possible for them. And we have a PhD who wants another degree. We'll see whether that's worthwhile.
Yeah.
So, should we get started?
Yes.
All right.
Let's dive into profile number one.
Hi.
International military officer. So they're applying for M7 and T15 schools. Let's get into the stats. The GMAT is 675. GPA 3.56. Top Canadian business school studying finance. They're 28, white. WorkX. Their entire work access in the military. They've got 5 years as a full-time officer. Currently, they're working in strategic headquarters, and they're frequently working on files that go up to the top, to the Prime Minister, to the Minister of Defense, the Canadian Chief of Defense Staff. Previously, since their graduation, they've been a part-time Canadian Army Reserve officer, and then they were deployed to train Ukrainian infantrymen responsible for leadership and command of 280 people in the unit. And the unit had a higher score and battlefield performance than other training groups. So really impactful stuff there. Not many extracurriculars, only a bit in fitness and running, personal extracurriculars. What they want to do after the MBA is transition into IB, investment banking. Why? Because they really enjoyed making high-level strategic decisions, and they want to do that in the business world. So yeah, let's get into it. What do you think of their profile?
Okay. Good stuff. So let's start with do a quick and dirty evaluation then, starting with academics. So 3.56 is a solid GPA, more or less in line with the 3.6 average of top business schools, or M7 business schools. So solid, slightly below. And then the GMAT as well, 675 converts to about a 720 or so on the old test, which is again 10 points, so slightly below the M7 average. So okay academics, nothing standout, but more or less in line. Professional, I think, is where things get interesting. So this applicant is going to be grouped and compared to other military applicants, right?
Yeah.
Every year, schools have like a rough idea of how many military people they're going to let in, and then they choose the best military applicants that they get to fill those particular spots. So OP is not competing against the investment bankers, right? Competing against the military officers. Now, and it reads to me, now we've only got a bit of description here, not a huge amount, but it does read to me like the OP's work experience, military experience is above average, so to speak. It looks very, very strong, particularly from a leadership standpoint. Schools are going to really, really like that. Then from an extracurricular standpoint, now this is where things get a bit hairy. Very little EC experience, OP says. And I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge. I can see why, but I would encourage OP to maybe try and build a bit more of an extracurricular narrative around the physical fitness stuff. So, for example, we've had military applicants in the past who didn't have much in the way of extracurriculars, but they did get involved in, for example, organizing a structured training program for people for other soldiers, and they kind of turned it into a group activity outside of work, so to speak. So it could be that physical fitness can be framed as an extracurricular with a little bit of the right massaging. Now, in terms of demographic, white Canadian is pretty ORM, not the worst, but it's fairly common demographic. And then the goals. There's a whole conversation here. Look, I think IB in the US in particular is going to be tough. And we can talk a little bit more about IB recruiting afterwards. Overall, solid profile. Definitely, I think, worthy of an M7 or a T15. I think that there is a question mark over whether those goals are the right ones, and I think we'll probably come to that in a moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned worthy of M7s or T15s. Can you get a little bit more into that? So what
Yeah,
chances do they have, and
like,
like what are reaches, what are safeties?
look, given that OP is academically kind of in line, a little bit below the M7s, I think he has to give it a shot. I think he'll regret it if he doesn't. But I would
Yeah.
say that the lack of ECs, the potentially, question marks over the goals, I think M7 is certainly not a shoe-in.
Yeah.
Bottom end of the M7, perhaps more likely than the top end, but not a shoe-in. But I think OP is very much a T15. Ought to be getting a T15 offer, maybe with a decent scholarship. What do I mean by decent? 40 to 60K ballpark, I think, from a
Mhm.
T15. I think OP should be quite happy with. That's more or less what I'm seeing in terms of schools.
Okay. And to get more specifically into IB recruiting in the US,
Yeah.
what are they there?
So, look, OP, apart from his finance undergrad, is not has not got the finance the finance experience required by an investment bank, or certainly not the classic finance experience required by an investment bank. The classic IB post MBA is somebody working in, for example, Big Four consulting in M&A, and I think we're going to come to that later today. It's somebody with that profile. So, in other words, doing basically the same thing as IB, but not quite, and then transitioning to investment banking. That is not what OP is doing. OP is going to make a very big leap. OP is moving not only into investment banking, but also arguably into the civilian working environment. So it
Yeah.
really is a big leap. And therefore, you're going to be reliant, OP, on the veterans networks of these schools. And I noticed that what this was mentioned in other comments. For example, here, like there was a comment around networking with the veterans clubs, for example. This is all very valid. OP is going to be really kind of put into that bucket of military applicants transitioning into the business, into the sort of commercial world. And the question then that comes up for me is, if you're relying on military networking to break in, how many Canadian military personnel are now in American investment banking? I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know the answer, but I suspect not so many.
Yeah.
So I would say that while investment banking is a credible post MBA goal, I think OP will have a more successful round of MBA applications by saying that they're going to start in investment banking in Canada, where they can probably, they will likely be able to leverage their Canadian Business School finance group as well. And obviously, the Canadian vet network is going to be much, much bigger in Canadian investment banking. And then maybe like long-term goal is to move across to the United States, for example. But given that OP is going to be making a really big leap here, I think OP needs to make that leap as small as possible by focusing on Canada post MBA. Also
Okay.
removes the visa uncertainty and the work permissioning, etc.
Yeah. Agreed. I think we've covered everything that OP was asking
Okay.
about.
OP,
It's really
one of my colleagues, Zach Hoyt, is an HBS grad who was in the US military, has a military background, one of the few MBA admissions consultants with credible military experience at a top MBA program. I would suggest get in touch via samweeks.com. You can book a meeting. It's a schedule free call button in the top right-hand corner of the website, and have a chat with Zach, and we'll be able to set you on the right path.
yes. All
Okay.
right.
Next
Um,
profile.
Next profile.
All right, let's
This
do
is
it.
a non-traditional one. This is quite
Okay.
interesting. School principal.
Mm-hmm.
Now she is 32, female, Indian, and Muslim. Uh, 9 years as a principal of a government-aided high school. Some stats in there as well. GMAT 695. They've done 2 degrees. That's a bachelor's in biotech and another one in education. 76 to 78%. Now, converted by WES, that's a 4.0 US equivalent. They had also a full scholarship. So went to college on a full scholarship. Key achievements, they've been a principal for 9 years. So within that time, 400 students and 30 plus staff. Lots and lots of really, really impactful numbers in there. They've set up admin systems, financial systems, reduced the trust's funding burden, personally raised 1.5 million rupees to cover annual expenses and also fund underprivileged students. Again, built a reserve fund through partnerships, small investments, done fundraisers, enrolled out of school children, digitized records. A lot of real ground foundational work done there. ECs, so elected treasurer of a local inner wheel club, which is a global women's volunteer organization. It's focused on promoting friendship and international collaboration through service. And long-time volunteer at a local orphanage. Goals, non-profit social impact consulting. That's right after the MBA. And after that, long-term return to India, start their own non-profit for skill-based education. Target schools, and also they want scholarships, so that's a priority as well. Target schools, lots of different geographies and school rankings and tiers in there. Let's go through them one by one. UK, LBS, and maybe Oxbridge. France or Singapore for INSEAD. India, they're looking at ISB. Australia at Melbourne Business School. Singapore, NUS, NTU, and in the US, Harvard or Duke Fuqua. So yeah, that's their profile. What do you think?
Mixed. Right, academics first. A solid GPA, equivalent to a 4.0, although because it's on an international system, it's not going to be included in the school's average. So it doesn't help as much as it would. GMAT 695, equivalent to about a 740 on the old test, which is a little bit above the M7 average. So certainly solid academics, as you might expect from a school principal. Professional, look, the school principal idea is cool. They don't get many applicants from this area, this part of the world. It's part of the sort of this industry. The flip side of that, though, is that 9 years of work experience is a lot. And 9 years of work experience, you can imagine, is going to be 10 or even 11 at matriculation of the program. That is going to be a really big factor, possibly a really big issue. In terms of demographics, Indian female is ORM for sure. Also worth noting that the OP is particularly vulnerable, as an Indian applicant, particularly vulnerable to any changes of policy in the US. Now, I suspect that's why OP is targeting schools from around the world. So you're definitely doing the right thing there, OP. But just to highlight, on the US side, the environment is not particularly friendly at the moment for our Indian applicants. In terms of goals, so the goal of moving to impact consulting is a solid one, and I can get that. I can see where that comes up, particularly if it's education related. If it was if you could kind of choose education related engagements, etc., or a non-profit in the education sector, again, you'd be very, very well qualified for that. But it is quite a common goal, so it's also going to need to differentiate yourself. And then on the other side, in the long term, come back to India and start a non-profit which provides skill-based education. That's perfect. That's obviously the right goal for a narrative. OP can speak to that indefinitely, continuously. Fine. Where I think, basically, summary here is, I think OP is a T25, T20 type candidate, and because of this key issue around the almost 11 years of work experience at matriculation, that is double the average of most of these programs. Sure, there are European programs that have got slightly higher work experiences, etc., and that's really where OP should be focusing. But even those are going to balk at seeing 11 years of work experience at matriculation. And so I am wary on that. Now, I think if I was in OP's shoes, I would be applying to T20, T25 schools, basically sort of this list, except for maybe the US bunch, this kind of group. But you're going to need to be lucky on age. In other words, they're going to have, by luck, you're going to have a very young group of applicants that year, or admitted applicants that year. and they're gonna be willing to offset your 11 years of work experience with two people who have got like 2 years work exp, and that you just don't know whether that's going to happen or not. It's really difficult. So numbers game is going to be key. You have to really apply to a lot of schools and then be lucky in terms of age.
Yeah. OP also has a few more like specific questions. We've already touched on this a little bit, but can we elaborate a bit more about the schools? Are they realistic targets for the GMAT specifically? And like you mentioned, the 9 years, going to be 10 years of matriculation of WorkX.
Yeah. So to reiterate on this, the GMAT is not going to be a problem, right? Not 40, 20, 25 schools. The average, the GMAT is above average for those schools. That's not going to be an issue. In terms of the 9-year work experience, that is going to be the issue. And the key is to focus on schools with a high average work experience. Basically, that's the shorter programs. 1-year programs tend to have a higher work experience average. Why? Because people who are doing a 1-year MBA do so because they don't need the internship in between years 1 and 2 to figure out their lives. They want to get back to work. They don't want to they haven't got as much time to pay off debt because they're later in their careers. For all of these reasons, older applicants tend to favor European and shorter MBA programs, and that is exactly where OP should be focusing. And as far as I can tell, that is where OP is focusing. So more of that.
Okay. What do you think about these mid-career programs for somebody with 9 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to offset this high, or to not have the years of work experience acting against you. So for those watching who don't know what a mid-career program is, most people are obviously aware of full-time MBA programs. A lot of people are aware of executive MBA programs. These are for like 15, 20 years of work ex, right? The few gray hairs over there. In the middle, you've got these mid-career programs. MIT Sloan Fellows is probably the most well-known one. Stanford have the MSX. And I think where OP perhaps wants to be looking at as well is the USC Marshall IBEAR program. These are programs that have got more like 12, 13 years of work experience average, where OP maybe next year, for example, will be really, really well qualified. Now, this raises the question, though, about scholarships, and I think is a good time to segue into this. OP says preferably seeking full ride scholarships. Well, welcome to the club, right? Hey, I want $250,000. Well, who doesn't? Right. So that is not really the right angle. I mean, yes, there are people who get into these schools with full ride scholarships. A couple of months ago, well, a little bit more, last year, I had a client who got into Oxford with a full ride scholarship. Now, that was not full ride off the bat, right? They had to apply to lots of other external scholarships, et cetera, and eventually they got themselves the full ride. But that is incredibly unusual. And this applicant was, to be frankly speaking, exceptional. And OP is not exceptional in that way. So OP, I think if you're looking at this, hoping to secure a full ride scholarship, I don't want to pee on your fire, but you're not going to get one, I don't think. I think you need to start looking at getting a loan, like most people do, and figuring out, how many years are you going to need to work at nonprofit at Impact Consulting to be able to pay that back. That is how you should be thinking about this. If you're expecting a full ride scholarship, I think you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment.
Okay. Yeah. And I think one more question OP has is that besides the MBA programs they've listed here, are there any other that align with their social impact, their scholarship needs?
So the two schools that really jump out for social impact are Oxford in Europe / UK and Yale in the US. Those are the schools that historically have had quite a strong focus on impact and those sorts of themes. Yale in particular historically has put like over 40% of their cohort into consulting, of which a large proportion is impact consulting. So for impact consulting generally, and for impact, those are the two schools that really jump out. But like I said, I think Yale is going to be a bit of a stretch for OP. Oxford should definitely be on their radar.
Okay. I think we've covered all of OP's questions. Are you ready to move on to the third profile?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. This is a Chinese applicant in Canada aiming for fall 2026 M7 schools. So now they have a few questions. We'll get to those later. Let's get into the stats first. Work experience. For one, they've got 4.5 years, joined Big Four audit in the renewable energy practice. 3 years later, Big Four accounting and transaction advisory as an assistant manager. Now they want more direct deal exposure in the sector. That goes into their goals, and that's why they want to do IB and also YMBA. Target schools: Wharton, CBS, Booth, Stern, and they're also open to, they mentioned M7 before, so they're open to the other top school options. Background: they're Asian, male, 26, Chinese citizen, but they've been in Canada since they were an adult. Now let's get into the story a little bit and why this renewable energy angle. They grew up in a semi-pastoral area of northwestern China. Their parents wanted to help build a growing community there. The region relies on traditional energy like coal, and then they saw firsthand the health and environmental toll it takes. That experience pushed them to want to drive change towards renewable energy, and that's also why they're focusing on that in their WorkX as well. Yep, WorkX, again, they've mentioned 3 years, EY, 1.5 years in Deloitte, both in Canada, focused on renewables. Undergrad, top-tier business program, Ontario, major accounting, minor economics. Nothing special, they're saying, for ECs, but there are some in there. There's volunteering as an English teacher in China during the summers, and also a career service volunteer. When they were in their undergrad, they were mentoring international students for resume and career strategy. They also have a CPA certification. Other stats: GRE 329, and their undergrad GPA was a 3.5. What do you think?
Hey, profile evaluation, quick and dirty. 329 GRE is solid, not exceptional, but it's solid. 3.5 GPA is, again, solid, but a little bit below average for the M7. Not exceptional, but okay. From a professional standpoint, I'm afraid also okay. This Big Four basically doing transaction advisory, that is a classic pre-MBA and pre-IB role. Looks like OP has been involved in some quite interesting transactions. So I think that's I think professionally solid as well. These extracurriculars says nothing special, but actually compared to that person we spoke about a minute ago who had literally zero, volunteering as an English teacher in China is actually quite substantial. The career service volunteering and mentoring students, like this is probably the most common extracurricular the schools see. Like pretty much everybody has volunteered, has somehow helped somebody applying to jobs or undergrad. It's not that doesn't really stand out, but the volunteering as the English teacher in remote China, that is interesting. And I remember back in the day, I did a trip to China and stayed with a friend who was doing exactly that. And yeah, there's a lot of cultural factors involved. There's quite a lot to talk about there. In terms of demographic, there's a question here, or sort of a mixture of demographics here, which is interesting, which is this idea of OP is very clearly Chinese, but has been in Canada since age 18. So presumably has work permissioning in Canada, is also, presumably English is absolutely fine. I see a 161 verbal there as well. So I think the way the school are going to look at OP from a demographic perspective is basically 50-50, right? 50% Chinese, 50% Canadian. Somewhere, I would say, not, if Canadian is typically a little bit URM and Chinese is a little bit ORM, I would say roughly neutral in terms of from a demographic perspective. Goals. Now, I really, really like this IB goals. This is a perfect candidate for making the leap into investment banking with an MBA. Already has the hard skills, has Deloitte on the resume, who is not particularly sexy, but certainly solid. And with the right MBA and the right training and the right attitude, could credibly make that transition to investment banking. So I like the goals. And then in terms of, I note that OP has focused also on the finance powerhouses. I'm sure that's deliberate, and that's exactly what I would be encouraging. Wharton, CBS, Booth, and Stern are probably the four strongest schools for finance. And so OP, you're absolutely on the right track there. So I would say, as a sort of summary on the profile, solid, but very like beige, like my shirt, I would say, Malvika,
Mhm.
in terms of like, in terms of the GRE, and in terms of the GPA, in terms of the work experience, very beige. And I hope that OP can come up with something to really spice that up. And that's something that hopefully, that maybe you'll work with the consultants, OP, and really bring out that something spicy here, because you're going to need some.
Yeah, I think along those lines, OP has a question about the GRE. So
Uh-huh.
he plans on applying fall 26, and with round one approaching, should they retake their GRE to kind of make their profile stronger, or push the plan to round two or even next year?
Yeah. Look, some people are going to tell you to split, and like kind of the logical thing, the logical in a way you could say thing to do is, well, apply to some this year and some next year. And I'm not going to advise that. You need to, it's much better if you can to apply to all of the schools in the same round, because then you're going to hear back from all of them at the same time and you can negotiate scholarships. Whereas if you get one offer in round one and one offer in round two, by the time it comes to round two, your round one offer has expired, so you can't use it to negotiate scholarships. So first thing is, yes, you're right to be thinking about everything in round one or everything in round two. The question about GRE specifically, what I would say to OP is, it depends on whether you are scoring higher in practice tests than this. In other words, if you feel like you can do better than a 329, then push to round two, right?
Mhm.
You're in such a overrepresented group of big four applicants that the GRE is going to be is frankly higher in that group, and it's going to be competitive. And so every point you can get will help. Even if you apply in round two with a 330 or a 331, like that would still be beneficial. So it's a tough one, but on balance, I would say push to round two with a higher GRE if there is potential for that based on your practice tests.
Mhm. Also, what can OP do to make their profile less beige, especially in terms of narrative? What I really like is it really lines up, the story about I grew up in this region where coal was used. I saw firsthand how it affected my community. I joined the big four in the renewable energy practice. It really aligns there. What do you think about this narrative, and what kind of stories do you think can be really powerful for people?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I really like about it is that China's emissions are making world news, right?
Mhm.
China burning coal offsets like all of the carbon saving initiatives in like UK, Germany, and France combined. Like it's an absolutely, everybody knows, like worldwide, this is a big issue. So by coming in as a Chinese applicant tackling this issue that is well known around the world, that's great. As opposed to, for example, trying to say that you're going to tackle this unknown issue that's like niche in northwestern China that nobody outside of there has heard of. That this is a broad world scale challenge that the schools have heard of. So I really like that as a theme generally. I also think that this idea of investment banking with a focus on renewable energy probably is the best way to go about tackling that issue, right? I would say that OP could be a little bit more specific, narrowing down goals away from strictly IB towards project finance is actually where I think OP should be focusing. And for those who aren't aware, project finance is kind of a subdivision within investment banking. And it's really focused on like how can we finance infrastructure projects like renewable energy. And so it's slightly different from investment banking. It's slightly different. And anyway, do your research on that. And there are slightly different banks that lead that space. All of this to say that if OP has a story that resonates with readers around the world, a plan to tackle it in a way that is slightly unique via project finance, and the hard skills from Deloitte to reach that goal, I think it's a full package. I really, really like it. The key is going to be putting them together in a clear, sequence. And basically what you're doing here, OP, is you're saying, I saw the problem when my grandma was coughing up coal, basically from back in the day. I saw the issue. My mission now is to clean up the air and clean up the emissions, particularly in northwestern China. To do that, I plan to, in the short term, join a project finance desk at a large bank with a longer term goal. I think OP hasn't talked about longer term goals, but something entrepreneurial related or even policy making related would be that kind of continues that theme. That would be a really nice long term goal. So basically, I really like the narrative, and I think it's probably a strength of OP's profile. And if it's played well, it could be the thing that spices up the profile and makes it a little bit less beige.
Great. I think we've covered thoroughly roasted OP. I think we can move on to the next one.
Okay, let's do it.
Low GPA, but redemption arc. Very, very movie-like. Let's see what's
Okay.
Stats. OP is ORM, age 29 when the MBA will start. 7 years of work experience at a major global bank in commercial banking. 2 promotions. They're currently a senior associate, and some leadership experience in there as well. Now here's the toughie. 2.5 GPA at an average state school. Changed majors midway. Had a few things that actually led to this GPA. Lost 3 family members in 18 months. They got depression, worked 3 jobs to pay for school. Lost in terms of where they want to go with their career, academic probation, failed classes. So yeah, quite a few factors into that GPA. Since then, now the redemption arc begins. Online masters in computer science at Georgia Tech, 4.0 GPA, GRE 338, 170 quant, 168 verbal. That's great. 8-month-long journey of study. Now they're quite aware that they'll need to address this in the optional essay. So they're like, okay, I'll be aiming to speak towards this low undergrad GPA. We'll speak towards the growth and why I am a different person. So that's really great. They're saying they don't really have many extracurriculars. They're skiing, recreational sports, working out, cooking, but nothing really like formalized, because they have a lot of free time between their masters, between work and GRE study. Now, why they want to do an MBA? They've worked in roles that sit between finance, strategy, and tech. When they're doing their masters, that deepened their appreciation for how tech can transform how financial services operate, and also expose some of the skill gaps that they have right now. So now with an MBA, they want to scale their impact. They want to start shaping within large systems instead of, just like executing tasks. They want to do this in fintech, embedded finance. So for this broader strategic lens, they want an MBA. Schools that they're targeting, they're saying, okay, T15 or bust. So their tiers start from T15, T10s, and M7s. How realistic do you think this profile is?
Yeah. Always a bit wary when I see something all bust, but let's go into it. Okay.
Roles, right?
Okay. So academic, right. Obviously the 2.5 GPA is a mess. Now, I did a little bit of work, a little bit of research beforehand, and I want to highlight Chicago Booth, GPA range. This is last year, the lowest in their class had a 2.36 GPA. So a 2.5 GPA is rubbish, but it's not necessarily the end of the world. And the GRE of 338 is absolutely exceptional. This is basically out of 170, and OP has a full marks for the quant and is only docked 2 points on the verbal. So that really is an exceptional GRE score, which will partially offset the undergrad GPA. Unfortunately, the master's GPA of 4.0 will not do that much lifting other than show them that you're fairly smart, but it doesn't affect their stats, right? Only the GRE, the undergrad GPA, are considered into their statistics, which they get ranked on. So unfortunately, that is not going to do as much as you might hope. From a professional standpoint, really quite interesting narrative here. Tech, I think it was the intersection of finance, strategy, and tech. That's a AdCom's wet dream. They absolutely love those, right? You've got a bit of finance, a bit of strategy, a bit of tech. These are three areas that a lot of people apply from any one of these, but rarely have people got all three. So you basically are a really interesting contributor to a classroom environment. That is really, really nice. And in addition to that, there's a really clear narrative here about why, like, that kind of how that fits into OP's goals and career story. So it sounds like OP has a really good professional background for the career goals essay. From a extracurricular perspective, now, avid skier. Every other, from what I can tell, every other involvement, all of the extracurriculars that OP has done have been solo endeavors, right? Skiing is typically pretty solo, cooking pretty solo, recreational, right? That's not much in the way of leadership necessarily there. So what OP needs to do, I think, between now and applying is forge somehow some leadership extracurricular activities. For example, you've been skiing in 20 seasons in a row. You're not applying to ski school. They don't care about your skiing. But what they do care about is if during that time you've helped teach somebody to ski or even taken classes, even better, then you can frame this as a leadership experience, and that they care about. So extracurriculars, maybe there's something there. It's possibly not as bad as it looks, but it will need a little bit of massaging or even new responsibilities. Demographic, all we know is ORM, so we'll just take their word for it there. And then in terms of goals, yeah, as I said, I really like where this narrative is heading. I would focus OP on roles that are industry specific. I could imagine, some people would say, oh, I've got lots of different experience, so I want to go into consulting. That would be a bit lazy and wouldn't allow you to maximize the experience you've got. I would say there's a very specific role somewhere in a corporate that mixes these and also has leadership responsibility in terms of managing a team in sort of a fintech finance space. That's where you should be focusing your post MBA goals for the essays.
Okay. Let's get into the schools a bit.
Okay.
You said you're wary of saying T15 will pass. So what are their chances realistically of T15?
Yeah. I think, look, you're going to need to be lucky, basically. As we've seen from Chicago Booth there, my other tab, the schools do let in people with 2-point-something GPAs. But what you need the stars to align, basically, you need them to have a bunch of really good young applicants who they're ready to let in, who are ready to admit, to offset your, high GPA applicants to offset your low GPA. On the flip side of that is if they have a very low GRE average at the moment, they're maybe willing to overlook your GPA to bring in your 338 and raise the GRE average. And basically, you've no way of knowing whether or not any given school in any given round or year is going to be receptive to each of these. So it basically comes down to a numbers game. I have seen people get into T15s with these kinds of stats, but at the same time, I've also seen people get disappointed with these kinds of stats. Is a bit of a luck of the draw element here. And so given the luck of the draw, the numbers game is going to be key. OP is looking at over 8 schools. So that is really the right angle. So OP, I would encourage you on that. And then I guess the answer is if none of them work out next year or next round, maybe you need to be looking at the T20s, and that's the next tier down. And that, then you need to decide whether it's worth it for you. I would argue that if your goals are corporate, fintech, interplay between finance and strategy, there are some T20s that can probably still help as well. But anyway, I hope that helps.
Okay. And this redemption arc that they're talking about, do you think it's strong enough? It's solid?
Yeah, I think the redemption arc, why it really matters is the optional essay. So OP's talked about this optional essay, and it looks like is planning on, writing about the low GPA in the optional essay. So that's great. I would say that I think it's going to sound a bit morbid here, but just bear with me, right? Losing 3 family members in 18 months, 3 close family members in 18 months, that in and of itself, you don't want it to sound just like an excuse as such. That would be, yeah, okay, that's one way to write the optional essay. But the next step is, what did you learn from this? How has this affected your plans and your goals and your ambitions in terms of sector, in terms of geography, in terms of long and short-term goals? There is a story there. And I would encourage OP to not just explain, people died, but people died, and this is what I learned, and this is how I recovered and how I rebounded. And potentially OP can actually maybe make that work in his or her favor in the optional essay. I would also say, again, not to be morbid, but 3 close family members, the strength of this argument will depend on who they are. If we're talking parents and siblings, then I can kind of get that. But if it's a grandparent who you say you were close to, that's going to be a bit less impactful, I'm afraid. And if it's 3 grandparents, that's going to be even less impactful. And basically, I've seen a lot of people who are applying to MBAs who are in their 30s have lost grandparents, and it didn't necessarily affect their GPA. So without that's basically how it's gonna look. So it will depend a little bit on who those family members are, and if you can frame that rebound in terms of lessons learned and decisions made.
Yeah, and do you think this would also work for them core essays?
Potentially. There's one essay that jumps to mind, really, with this losing 3 close family members. For example, Yale have options for the main essay, and essay, I think it's option 3, is about describing your most significant challenge. And I think overcoming the loss of the family members, but still graduating and still breaking into the industry that you're hoping for, that could be a very, very strong Yale essay. And especially, I mean, at Yale are in this T15 bracket that OP is aiming for. That is, that could potentially be very, very useful indeed. Again, it'll come down to the emotional intelligence and the lessons that have come from this.
Okay. And when it comes to the narrative, so they've got this narrative about completing a master's in computer science, which is where during that time is when they started really appreciating how tech can help financial services. They really transform how they operate. So what do you think about that aspect of it?
Not a massive fan. I like the goal of, and I like the kind of the realization of seeing how tech can affect financial services and then going down that route in their career. Great. What I don't like is that OP have this realization during their masters, which presumably is a few years ago. They got 7 years of work experience. Presumably they did their masters about 7 years ago, you'd think. The question then is going to be, if this matters so much to you, why are you only doing it now? If you realized it during your masters. So I would encourage OP to stick with that realization, but it might be more impactful if you can have that realization during your current work. During your current work in commercial banking, which, by the way, would give you an opportunity to talk more about your commercial banking and maybe your promotions, which is a relatively underrepresented sector in MBA applications. And so that could potentially benefit you as well. So in conclusion, I like the idea of realizing that there's a problem here and using this work to tackle the problem, but I don't think that realization should really be so long ago, if possible. I think that undermines the story a bit.
Okay. Okay, good. I think we've covered everything in this profile.
Okay.
Let's go to our last profile of the day.
Okay.
Now, this is somebody who's looking for degree number 4, which is going to be their MBA. They have a doctorate already and a master's in undergrad. So, very strong academic profile. Let's get into it. GRE 333. They're targeting GSB, Sloan, Haas, HBS, Booth. Some things about their background is that they'd had over 3.91 GPA from UCLA and then a 3.7 grad GPA from Caltech, all in chemical engineering, and then a PhD as well. They're Asian, male, 31 years old, work experience, process engineer at Micron US for 1 year. They also were in the Korean, so they had the 3 years of army experience in Korea. So they've got Korean citizenship to them. Process product technology development in the semiconductor field, including scaling up pilot to full scale. Already have some publications and a patent published. Extracurriculars, teaching assistant during grad school for 4 years. Also, they're queer, so they've been volunteering at the Korean Queer Youth Support Organization for 3 years as well. Why they want to do an MBA? Transition out of R&D, transition out of academia. One of the options would be a startup. Not very clear what about this goal entirely, but it's relevant to their background, to their experiences. Their recommenders, also grad school supervisor, is currently running a startup, and their current supervisor is also preparing for a startup. Basic wanting to hone business and soft skills and network. That's their YMBA. What do you think about their profile overall?
Yeah. Okay, let's start academically. 3.91 undergrad GPA, very, very, very solid. 3.7 grad GPA, also strong, but doesn't matter as much because not being counted in the stats, as we've talked about. 333 GRE, very, very solid. And I can just knock this question on the head about OP is asking, should he be taking the GRE again because Asian males tend to have higher GREs? It's true that they do tend to have higher GREs, but honestly, I don't think anyone's going to look at this profile from an academic perspective with a 3.91 GPA, a 333 GRE, and a PhD and think, maybe you're not that smart. I don't think anyone's going to have that issue. I think that's quite I think it's academically strong for sure. Professional. Semiconductors is a really sexy subject at the moment, sexy industry at the moment. Everything relating to sort of, the whole AI and the FANG story that is playing out in stock markets in particular is really, really, the schools are looking for people in this sector for sure. So that helps. And it sounds like OP's work in that space has been pretty impactful as well, scaling this lab. And I'm sure OP has learned a thing or two during that time. They don't care too much about the publications and patents. Net patents. Now, extracurriculars. This is really, really strong. Teaching assistant, I see that a lot, but more impactfully, this Korean Queer Youth Support Organization, as an LGBTQ person, this is going to be a very strong leadership story potentially. So I like that from an extracurricular perspective. That's very strong indeed. Demographic, Korean. I think Asian male, but I think we can assume Korean. Not ORM, but not URM either. So Indian and sort of white is perceived from a demographic perspective as more ORM. And then there are areas, for example, parts of Africa, etc., that are very URM. Korean, I would say, is somewhere in the middle, some slightly neutral. And then in terms of goals, this is I'm unsure, right? One of the options would be a startup. It's unclear whether OP means to found a startup or to join a startup, and there's quite a big difference there that we can discuss. And one other question mark that I had, one other factor that might come into the profile evaluation here is regarding recommenders. OP is talking about getting recs from grad school supervisor. That, to me, is a concern. MBAs generally do not want grad school supervisors as recommenders. They want work experience recommenders. So that OP there is shooting themselves in the foot a little bit. The other recommender is a current supervisor, so that's great. But OP, I would strongly encourage you to try and find somebody else at your current company, maybe your boss's boss, for example, and improve, who would give a stronger, a more respected LOR. So overall, very, very, very solid. And I think OP is targeting the right schools, basically the M7.
Mhm. What do you think about their goals? They did mention, we spoke about recommenders just now. They did mention that both their recommenders are involved in startups or planning for a startup, but it's a bit unclear what they mean by, by the goals. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. Basically, having a short-term post-MBA goal of entrepreneurship, if you don't have entrepreneurship experience, is a bit of a pink flag for schools. Basically, they're going to be quite worried. There's no guarantee that you're going to be able to set up your startup after the MBA. And if you don't, you're going to be unemployed, grumpy, poor, none of the things the school want. So having entrepreneurship as a post-MBA goal is really only valid if it's really only a strong narrative if you've got entrepreneurship beforehand in your experience. In other words, I'm going to go back to my startup. If the entrepreneurship, what he means here is to join a startup where OP perhaps has a network already, and I wonder if that's where this sort of what OP is getting at here. If your post-MBA goals are to join a startup, more generally speaking, that is a good, solid post-MBA goal, particularly if it's in a sector that you are an expert in, which it sounds like as a researcher with a PhD, OP is an expert in this area, and that is a strong post-MBA goal.
Okay. OP has one question about any blind spots in the application, or is there anything else that they can do to, to really strengthen the application before they apply?
Yeah, I guess in terms of blind spots to be mindful of, I think you're maybe thinking that your PhD is strengthening your profile, but I think schools are going to see that as a little bit of a pink flag or a question mark. You've already had all the academic experience that you could really need. I guess with a PhD and undergrad and and a master's, you've probably been in school for 7, 8 years already, and you want to go and do 2 more. That's going to be a question mark, particularly as this idea of pivoting from R&D to maybe a more commercial role, tech development role in your sector. I would argue you could do that already. So be mindful that you're going to need to be very, very clear about why you need an MBA, given how much academic experience you've got. That's one thing. And, optional essay might be relevant for that. You might want to use your main career goals essay to touch on that point specifically, but be mindful of that as a blind spot. The other thing I would say in terms of strengthening your application, the big one is if you are looking to pivot away from research into this, where was it? The sectors, goals here, process, product, technology development in semiconductors as a, actually, that's a work experience. Transitioning out of MBA, out of R&D to a startup. Okay. The main question mark they're going to ask is, can you do that without a MBA? And if not, and if you're going to say, no, I can't, I need an MBA to gain these following skills, I would say you show them how meaningful that is, how serious that is, by already starting to get those skills. Right. What do I mean by this? So if you're saying I'm going to transition from R&D to a startup via an MBA, I'm going to use an MBA to get strategy skills, which weren't in my PhD. Strategy skills must be so important to you that what you could do is already start working and start doing some strategy related work, whether it's some impact consulting on the side, for example, where you start to strategize pro bono with startups. Maybe you want to do some strategy focused qualifications, right? Some sort of online qualifications that demonstrate that. In other words, you're showing them that an MBA is so important to you for strategy that you're already starting to do that outside of work. That's
Yeah.
the key thing I would be thinking of. I know I have a bit of a mouthful there, but hopefully I've come across clearly.
Yeah, that was pretty clear. What do you think about the ECs?
Volunteering at the Korean Queer Youth Support Organization for 3 years. It's very strong. Now, why is it strong? I'm thinking thinking ahead here in terms of stories that might be interesting. You could talk about, for example, and I'm almost sure there's a story here, just reading between the lines, having been queer in the military service for 3 years, I'm sure was pretty tough. I'm sure OP encountered some form of discrimination, etc., bullying, for example, like things along those lines that OP could easily say, and yeah, I don't want other queer people to have to go through that like I did. So I started volunteering at the Korean Queer Youth Support Organization to start, empowering and teaching young queer people to defend themselves and stick up for themselves and provide support, etc. And so here's how I did that. That is a really, really strong essay or interview answer as well. So I think basically ECs are very, very strong. And I think it's probably a strength in OP's profile.
Yeah. I think we've covered all of OP's questions, and
Okay.
that's all of the files for today. Let's move on to the bonus, which I
Yeah.
picked specifically for you.
Fantastic.
This is about MBA internship return offers for banking. And I don't know anyone else who can speak to this better. Can you speak to return offers for IB? How does it typically go down? And what happens if you don't get a return offer? Is banking completely out the door if I can't secure the return?
Yeah. Okay. So speaking from personal experience, then, so I did an internship at Merrill Lynch, who are Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, who are one of the big investment banks in the United States. Did not secure a return offer for various reasons, but got into a different investment bank instead afterwards, SocGen in London. And so now, granted, that was a few years ago, and it wasn't coming out of the MBA, but I have been through the IB recruitment process multiple times. So I do feel like I can add a bit of color to this. Basically, in a given year, the number of people that are doing internships that secure offers varies. There are years when you have to, most people are going to secure an offer unless they mess up something during the internship. And there are years when it's an absolute bun fight and it's very, very difficult to secure an offer from the post-MBA internship. But the point is, there's always some spots. There's always some spots. And if you really crush the internship, then you ought to be able to convert it. One thing that I would advise specifically, and a bit of a mistake that I made, was you need to really pick a desk. So what typically happens during an investment banking internship is you rotate between two or maybe more desks. For example, a credit trading desk and a commodity sales desk, for example, and you maybe move around between these, and you'll get a bit of. They'll say, "Oh, you're getting a bit of a feel for the different areas of the bank, etc." And yes, that's great, but you're also spreading yourself out, and it's difficult to get a really good, build a very strong network with a particular desk if you're moving off afterwards. So one piece of advice I would give people who are going down this route is to find ideally in advance the desk that they're going to target and really crush it with one desk, with one MD who's going to make that recruiting decision, as opposed to hedging your bets and trying to impress lots of different MDs and lots of different desks. Somebody who's focused on that particular desk will outperform you typically. So don't hedge your bets. Really focus on one. Show commitment, networking, go to all the desk drinks, stay late, help people out individually on a task by task basis, and hopefully you'll secure the offer. Now, there's another angle here, Mal, which I think is interesting on how to be strategic about this. I had a client a couple of years ago who then came back to me to help with the investment banking recruitment process. We did some more investment banking interviews, etc. And he secured offers from two bulge bracket investment banks. In fact, I think it was a few more, but two main ones. One of them was Goldman Sachs, who are sort of the HBS, I guess you could say, of investment banking. And the other one was a bulge bracket bank that's less well known, originally a UK bank. Now, a lot of people would say you've got to go to Goldman. You've got to go and do that internship at Goldman because it's a better brand. But actually, he chose the other desk because the Goldman cohort is going to be more competitive. You're going to be going up against more competitive interns, and therefore the chances of securing a return admit, he thinks, were lower. In contrast, he had this other desk, this other bank, where you'd think the caliber might be of his peers might be a little bit lower, which gives him a strategic advantage. But also, he felt he had a bit of a vibe with that desk. So those two combined, he actually chose to intern at the less well-known bank, which he can then convert it into a full-time role, and he's absolutely crushing. So just being strategic about which bank to choose is also a factor to be really mindful of that I don't think has come up in the comments here. But broadly, I think also this comment that has been made there is a very solid one, which is around like what happens if you don't get an investment bank offer in your internship. You need to go hit the ground again, is basically what they're saying. And that's right. You need to go back out to the recruitment, to all the people that you met, and kind of follow up and position yourself as a backup candidate if they don't fill their class. And that is that's pretty good advice there on the from Ben Herder.
Okay, I think yeah, we've covered all of our profiles, our bonus questions, some really valuable insights today. Thank you, Sam.
Awesome stuff. Awesome stuff. Well, if you've watched this resume roast, this Reddit roast, and you've enjoyed the output, make sure to like and support us by following the channel. We roast people every week, and if you'd like your profile to be roasted, feel free to send us a DM on Reddit, and we will include it in our roast next week. And if you're looking for admissions consultants, feel free to book an introduction call at soundweeks.com. We'd love to help you with your MBA applications. Mal, it's been great as usual. I'll see you for the next roast.
All right. See you then.
Cool. See ya.